Hello, and welcome to another lesson in our series entitled The Teachings of Jesus in Matthew. In this lesson, we'll be looking at a passage from chapter 23 of Matthew's Gospel, and the title of the lesson is Practicing What We Preach. A little background again. We believe this Gospel was written by Matthew, who was a Jewish tax collector who left his tax collection tables, and followed Jesus when Jesus called him there in Galilee during Jesus' early ministry. So therefore, Matthew was a disciple, one of the 12, and as such was an eyewitness. He saw Jesus' ministry, he saw his healings, he heard his teachings. We believe he has written this gospel account some 30 to 40 years after Jesus' death and resurrection and ascension, and he's writing from a Jewish perspective, since he is a Jew, and he's taking Mark's gospel that basically tells us what Jesus did, and he is expanding it by telling us not only what Jesus did, but what Jesus said. Again, he's writing from a Jewish perspective, and he is specifically writing to a Jewish audience, to people who were Jewish in their background, who understood the Old Testament, especially the prophecy of Daniel chapter 7, and he is writing to show from Jesus' own words that Jesus is the Messiah. He is the one prophesied in Daniel chapter 7. Jesus refers to himself again and again as the Son of Man, which is a direct relationship to Daniel chapter 7. Most of Matthew's gospel is centered around Jesus' ministry in Galilee, that province to the north of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus and his 12 traveled from town to town, village to village, synagogue to synagogue. The message Jesus was preaching to the crowds was, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near." Daniel chapter 7 has been fulfilled. He was also healing people, casting out demons, and drawing large crowds. And then Matthew would show us from time to time, Jesus would take his disciples aside, and he would teach them. These who had already accepted the fact that Jesus was the Messiah, he would try to teach them what this kingdom that he was establishing was all about, spiritual, not political. And he was teaching them how they should live as citizens of this kingdom. Matthew's gospel can be divided into 5 sections of teachings. There's that opening teaching in chapters 5 through 7, which we call the Sermon on the Mount. Then there's chapter 10, chapter 13, chapter 18. And then the final section is in chapters 23 through 25. And that's what we'll be looking at today. Now, Jesus has had confrontations with the scribes and the Pharisees, the Sadducees, other Jewish religious leaders from time to time. But by the time we get to chapter 23, Jesus has now returned to Jerusalem for Holy Week. He has made his entrance into the city on Palm Sunday, and he is having further discussions during that week in the temple with religious leaders. Now, Jesus already knew that the Pharisees were openly opposed to him. In fact, back in chapter 12, verse 14, after the Pharisees had confronted Jesus for breaking the law on the Sabbath by healing the man, and Jesus refuted them. Matthew says, "But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus." So Jesus understood that these religious leaders were rejecting him, even to the point of being willing to kill him physically. Now he is back in Jerusalem during Holy Week. He has gone into the temple, and he is having confrontations with Sadducees and Pharisees. Now, let's talk a little background about the development of Judaism. When the Babylonians took the tribe of Judah, the Jews, into exile under King Nebuchadnezzar, the temple was destroyed. They were taken out of Jerusalem to Babylon, about 1,000 miles away, based upon the way they would travel at that point in time along the Euphrates River. It would take some 4 months to make that trip by foot. So they were a long ways from Jerusalem. Furthermore, Jerusalem had been destroyed and the temple had been destroyed. So their normal style of worship, that is the priest offering the sacrifices at the altar at the temple, that had been destroyed. Their worship changed significantly. They began to worship in small groups while they're in Babylon, something we today would call a home church. And together they would read the Psalms, sing the songs, they would read from the prophets, and they would read from the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The teacher would lead them by explaining the Torah and the scriptures so they could have a better understanding. The teacher they called the rabbi. And during this time, the spiritual leader of Judaism shifted from the priest, since there was no longer a temple available, to the rabbi who was teaching in the synagogues. Now, these rabbis some of them were, but most of them were not priests, so they did not have that priestly training or background. But they did have individual levels of education and background that caused them, as they studied the Torah, to come up with some different understandings of what the Torah meant. With this, there began to develop groups of followers to one rabbi or another rabbi, and you begin to develop some differences. We call them sects, S-E-C-T-S, sects within the Jewish faith. Now, after 70 years, the Babylonians were defeated by the Persians, and the Persian king allowed the Jews to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. When they went back, they took with them their synagogue worship. And they took with them this freedom, if you will, to have differences of opinions as to what the faith meant. Even though we had rebuilt the temple, reestablished the priesthood, they still worshiped in their synagogues, and they still had their little individual groups. These groups, some over a course of time, some would develop even into a quasi-political group as well. Okay? One of the groups that developed, not as a sect, but an occupation that grew when they got back to Jerusalem and rebuilt the temple, were the scribes. Now the scribes, it was an occupation. These were trained people. These were learned people. These were men who could read and write. Now most of the scribes belonged to the Pharisee sect, but not all of them. The scribes would spend their life studying the scriptures, teaching the scriptures. They call them teachers of the law. And they would also take the law and to try to help the people be faithful to the law, show them how it applied to everyday life. Now what this necessarily meant is they started the 10 Commandments and then the other laws from Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and then they would interpret it and say, and this is how it applies to everyday life. So, remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. Well, they understood that to mean you should not work. Well, what is work? Well, was picking a grain of wheat and breaking it open and eating it, was that harvesting? They said yes. They developed all these rules that were basically interpretations and applications of the law. Now, these were the scribes. Like I said, it was an occupation. Now, when they got back to Jerusalem, the law became very, very important. First of all, they recognized that they had gone into exile because of their failure to obey the law. So there was this real emphasis on reading and understanding the law. Remember, after they got back, Ezra had that great time where he read the law out loud to all the people. The people promised they would follow the law. So the law took on a new significance. And these scribes were the ones who were researching and writing and applying, and they came up with all these rules. I mean, they came up, for example, how much could a burden weigh, something you were carrying weigh, and still not be violating the law of working on the Sabbath? and they got it down to like a fig leaf, the weight of a fig leaf, something like that. They had all these rules written down, and then in addition to these written rules, they over time would develop oral rules, laws that they didn't actually write down, but they would teach orally. These oral rules were later written down in something called the Mishnah, and the oral rules would take up 800 pages. So you've got the written rules and the oral rules, and this is what the scribes are promulgating, if you will. And during this same time, one of the particular sects of Judaism developed called the Pharisees. Now the word Pharisees means the separated ones. And this particular group, and this was more of a religious group, this particular group would say that the way to maintain relationship with God was by strictly, faithfully adhering to every rule, every law, every rule, verbal and written. Now, some of the Pharisees were scribes. Not all of them, but a few of them. Most of the scribes were Pharisees, as you can see. But this group of separated ones took it upon themselves not only to very carefully follow all the law themselves, but then to insist that others do so as well. Now, the Pharisees gained significance during the time when Antiochus Epiphanes, who was one of the descendants of the Greek rulers, when he tried to wipe out Judaism, the Pharisees were the ones who were standing up and defending the faith by following all the little details of the law. You see, following the law made them distinctive, and they were standing up for and defending the faith. Now, after the Antiochus Epiphanes and the Greeks were defeated, they had to go off and fight the Romans, and that allowed the Jews to have their own independence for a period of time under the Hasmoneans. Then the Pharisees became very, very influential because they were seen as the protectors of faith. They were seen as the ones who were protecting the Jewish faith, and they followed the rules very, very carefully, and insisted that others follow the rule. Now, as I said, the setting for this lesson is these Pharisees now, having existed these hundreds of years. Well, let's first of all mention the fact. At this point in time, scholars tell us there maybe was like 4 million Jews. Of the 4 million Jews, only 6,000 were Pharisees. There were 4,000 Essenes, we'll talk about them later, and there were even fewer Sadducees, and we'll talk about them later. But there are only 6,000 Pharisees. That's not that many, considering that size of a nation. But they had significant influence, and the people would listen to them, and the people would watch them, and the people were very, very impressed with how careful these Pharisees would, the steps they would take to follow the law. Now, as I said, the setting for this particular passage is in Jerusalem, in the temple. Jesus has been in the temple, and he has had a confrontation with the Sadducees where they questioned him about a life after death. Now, the Sadducees did not believe in life after death, so they're asking him a question about it. Just showed their insincerity. Well, after Jesus had answered their question, or had confronted them and left them with an answer they couldn't refute, everybody was amazed. The people standing there in the temple watching this exchange, they were amazed. Then the Pharisees came up. Now, the Pharisees and Sadducees didn't get along. The Pharisees were very, very strict in observance of the law. The Sadducees were much more liberal, and they interpreted the law widely. Pharisees believed in afterlife, life after death. The Sadducees did not. But they had a common enemy, Jesus. So after the Sadducees were not able to trip Jesus up, because what they were trying to do was get Jesus to say something there in the temple that would cause the crowd to turn against him. Because just the day before, the crowds had lined the streets on Palm Sunday, welcoming him as the king. And now they're trying to get the crowd to turn against him. Well, after the Sadducees had failed, then a Pharisee, an expert in the law, came up and asked Jesus that question about which is the greatest commandment. Well, after that exchange, Matthew tells us, no one could say a word in reply. And from that day on, no one dared to ask him more questions. Okay? And that's the conclusion of chapter 22. And then we begin with chapter 23. Chapter 23 talks of Jesus addressing the disciples. Now he's in the temple. He's just had this confrontation with the Sadducees and then the Pharisees. And now he begins to speak to his disciples. Now understanding that as he's talking to his disciples, there are others in the crowd that are listening. And he begins with chapter 23 and he gives a warning. Now, we've talked about in a previous couple of lessons that Jesus was teaching the disciples how they should live as citizens of the kingdom. If I could summarize it, I would say now he is going to teach them how they should not live as citizens of the kingdom. Because he's going to take the Pharisees who were standing right there, who have challenged him and he's had that confrontation with them. He's going to use them as an example of how they should not live. So, in chapter 23, he gives what scholars will call the 7 woes to the Pharisees. The 7 woes. The word woe contains an element of sorrow and also an element of danger. The word woe is a word that was used at a funeral or at the time of death of a loved one by someone who was deeply, deeply moved with sorrow. So Jesus is pointing to these Pharisees and is saying, woe, there's danger in living like them. There is sorrow in living like them. He's pointing them out as a negative example. Now, this would have caught the attention of the crowd. Jesus has a reputation for 3 years now, having traveled everywhere, and he's teaching love, kindness, peace, forgiveness. He's teaching them about this spiritual kingdom, not a political kingdom. And he's been talking to these disciples about living lives of care and concern for others. Now, it's almost like he's angry. Now, it's a new side of him. They're seeing a side of him they haven't seen. And he says, woe to these Pharisees. Woe. Let me just read to you the first couple of woes because our lesson actually centers on the last 4. Starting with chapter 23, verse 13. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's face. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those who are trying to. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You travel over land and sea to win a single convert. And when you have succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are. Woe to you, blind guides! If you say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing, but anyone who swears by the gold of the temple is bound by that oath. You blind fools, which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing, but anyone who swears by the gift on the altar is bound by that oath. You blind men, which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Therefore, anyone who swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. Anyone who swears by the temple swears by it and the one who dwells in it. Anyone who swears by heaven and swears by God's throne and by the one who sits on it, swears by God's throne and by the one who sits on it. So he's pointing this out, these things that they are doing that are totally contrary to his teaching, totally contrary to accepting him as the Messiah. Having given those 3 woes, we then begin in chapter 23, in verse 23, and we go to the next woe. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. Okay? He's pointing out to them, he's called them hypocrites already. Now he's pointing out the extent of their hypocrisy. Now, the law, the Mosaic law, in Deuteronomy and in Leviticus, required that 1/10 of that which was produced should be given to the Lord. And Jesus was not disputing the fact that there was the law requiring that 1/10 of agricultural products. Now, The law then defined what was subject to the tithe. Everything which is eatable and preserved and has its nourishment from the soil is liable to be tithed. That's the way the scribes had interpreted the law. Everything that grows from the soil has to be tithed. A tenth of it has to be paid. Well, Jesus acknowledges that the law requires a tithe. And he's acknowledging that these leaders are being faithful. Even to a detail, Barclay wrote, it was universally accepted that the tithes of the main crops must be given. The wheat, the barley, the crops they would eat and crops they would sell. But mint, dill, and cumin are herbs of the kitchen garden and would not be grown in any quantity. A man would have only a little patch of them. All three were used in cooking, and dill and cumin had its medical uses. To tithe them was to tithe an infinitesimally small, maybe not much more, a small crop, maybe not much more than the product of one plant. Only those who were superlatively meticulous would tithe the single plant of the kitchen garden. So what we're saying is they would raise these little individual plants in their kitchen garden to be used in the kitchen, and they not only were tithing the crop from the field, which the law required, they had followed the very detailed amount of the law, and they would give a tenth of the little plant that they raised in the kitchen for cooking purposes. They would tithe that. And so Jesus is saying, you did that, and that's fine. But look at what you're not doing. He accuses them of neglecting the more important matters, the matters of the law. What did the law require? Justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Again, the commentator writes, they were also absolutely meticulous. They were so absolutely meticulous about the tithes that they would tithe even one clump of mint. Yet these same men would be guilty of injustice, could be hard, arrogant, and cruel, forgetting the claims of mercy, could take oaths and pledges and promises with the deliberate intention of evading them, forgetting fidelity. In other words, many of them kept the trifles of the law and forgot the things which really matter. They got hung up on a little bit, but they did not give attention to the significant requirements of the law: love, justice, mercy, forgiveness, etc. Then Jesus uses a hyperbole. He uses something extreme as an example to describe these folks. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. Now here's what he's referring to, and this would be something that we would not understand. In that day, everything about eating for the Pharisees centered on what was clean. Okay? A camel was not clean, and everybody understood. It was an unclean animal. A gnat, being an insect, was not clean. Now what Jesus is saying is the Pharisees had a habit of taking the wine, the wine that's come from the grapes. They would take their wine, and before they would drink it, they would strain it through a piece of cloth, like a gauze. They would strain it. Why? Just to make sure that some little gnat didn't get into that wine without them knowing it, and they might accidentally drink that gnat with the wine, and in doing so, defile themselves. And so Jesus uses this hyperbole. He says, you go to the extreme to make sure that you don't even take one little gnat because it's unclean. And then you'll turn right around and swallow a camel. Now, the imagery of a person trying to swallow a camel is laughable, and it would get the attention. It would be humorous for his listeners. But it was an extreme message. You would go so far to make sure you don't eat a gnat, but yet you'll turn right around and not even think about swallowing the camel. This was the hyperbole Jesus used to show just how hypocritical these people were. They missed the point. They missed the point. They were so caught up on the details, as we would say, they missed the forest by looking at the trees. Well, let's go on to verse 25. another woe. Woe to you, you teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but the inside are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the dish, and then the outside will also be clean. Okay? Jesus continuing this line about them being hypocrites. And here's the example he uses. Now again, the feature of the message of the Pharisees was that you had to avoid all uncleanness. Okay? Certain animals were unclean, like we talked about the camel and the gnat. But now we're talking about uncleanness in a spiritual sense, not in a physical sense. We're talking about being unclean. So touching certain things would cause you to be unclean. Touching a dead body would cause you to be unclean. There are certain things that would cause you to be spiritually unclean. Now, the concern was they would take a dish and they were concerned about it being clean. So what they were doing, and by cleanness, they are symbolizing that for righteousness. To make sure that these vessels are clean, they would wipe. They would spend all kinds of time wiping the outside and making sure the outside was clean. But what they weren't doing is paying attention to what was inside. Inside was the uncleanness. It was inside the cup that had all of the unclean, the greed, the self-indulgence, the harsh attitudes that he's already described earlier. He says, you're on the inside, you're full of all of this evil, but on the outside, you're so clean and we want everybody to think you're so righteous. That's what a hypocrite is. One who is pretending to be something that's not. And what Jesus gives them the instruction, he says, clean the inside of the cup. Then the outside will be clean. It's this idea that your outward acts should reflect your inward life. If you clean up the inside, then the outside will be clean. If you are righteous inside, your outward acts will be righteous. You can do all these righteous things on the outside and still not be righteous because of your attitude, what's inside. So he says, you hypocrites, you clean up the outside, but you don't tend to what's going on inside. Then he goes on. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of bones and the dead and everything unclean. Now, as I said before, touching a dead body would cause you to be unclean ceremonially. You couldn't go to the temple and worship. You were barred from worshiping God because you were spiritually unclean. There was a process you had to go through of cleansing before you could worship in the temple. Well, not only was touching a dead body, but touching the grave where a dead body was buried. For you see, when there's something that's unclean, anything that touches it is unclean. Then anybody who touches it is unclean. You see how it goes on. So here's what would happen. Cemeteries, a lot of times, were right along the roadways, especially going into Jerusalem. When the crowds were going to Jerusalem for the Passover or the other celebrations, large crowds, and as they're walking along, sometimes they would stray off the road. And the problem was, if they inadvertently got over into a cemetery, got over where a grave was, by touching that grave, they would be defiled, and then when they got to Jerusalem, they wouldn't be able to participate in the Passover because they were ceremonially unclean, and it took a process to get clean. So what would happen is, as a protection, they would whitewash the graves of dead people, the graves. They would whitewash them. Now, we would say, oh, that would make them very pretty. Well, the reason they whitewashed them was not to make them pretty, but was to make them stand out so people would avoid touching them and not become unclean. And Jesus says, you hypocrites, you scribes and Pharisees, all of your outward acts of righteousness. You're like that tombstone. You're pretty and white on the outside, but on the inside you're full of dead bones. The same thing he said before about the cup. You're clean on the outside, but defiled on the inside. You are pretty and white on the outside, but you're full of dead bones on the inside. You are defiled on the inside. So he's coming back to the same idea. You hypocrites. You're making people think you're all pretty and white on the outside, but on the inside you're full of anger and unfaithfulness, full of lies. This would describe the Pharisees. See, the Pharisees had a way of saying that they could take an oath and still break that oath without being unrighteous because of a certain thing they would do. They had interpretations for everything. He says, in the same way, that of the whitewashed tombstones, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. And you see, as Jesus is pointing to these Pharisees and pointing out their hypocrisy, he's saying by implication, don't live like them. Woe to them. You want to avoid the woe. Don't live like them. Well, let's go on to verse 29. You teachers of the law, Pharisees, you hypocrites, you build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. You say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have taken part in them, in the shedding of the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Go ahead then and complete what your ancestors had started. Okay? He's referring to the fact that a part of Jewish history had been that the prophets of God who came to point out the unfaithfulness of God's people were mistreated by the people of the past. The Jewish kings had prophets killed because the prophet would point out to the king that he was not living faithful to God. Remember, both in Israel and in Judah, we had kings who were worshiping idols and other gods and leading the people to worship other gods. And when a prophet would come and point that out and point out their unfaithfulness, they would have these prophets killed. And so he's saying to them, you're hypocrites. Because now, the people who are living in Jesus' day, these Pharisees who claim to be the protectors of righteousness, they are decorating and honoring the graves of those prophets who had been killed for being the messenger of righteousness. He's saying, it's your parents that killed them, and you have their same DNA. He says, your parents killed these folks, and you aren't any better. And he says, the reason he could point to them and say, you're not any better, because he knows they've already started plotting to kill him. Just as their parents rejected God's messengers in the past, he's pointing to them and saying, and although you are now saying, we would have never done that like our parents did, you're doing the same thing. By rejecting Jesus, they were doing the same thing. And he basically taunts them. He says, go ahead. Go ahead and do it. Go ahead and do as you can complete what your ancestors started. You're no better than your ancestors. You're just, even though you now say, oh, we would have never done that, in fact, you are going to do it. And in just a couple of days, he will be crucified. So he's pointing out the hypocrisy of these Pharisees. And he says, and what you're saying now is going to be the testimony. After you have basically executed Jesus, the crowds will be able to look back and say, they're just like their parents. Jesus is right. They're hypocrites. Well, let's go on. Verse 33. You snakes, you brood of vipers. Now from hypocrites, he's calling them other names. You snakes, you brood of vipers. Brood of vipers. How will you escape being condemned to hell? This term, snake and brood of vipers, This is what John the Baptist had called the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders when they came out to where he was baptizing, Matthew 3:7. But when he, John the Baptist, saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming to where he was baptizing, he said to them, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the coming wrath?" Now, the understanding was, the viper, the snake, the understanding in Jewish thought was that the snake in the Garden of Eden that tempted Eve was in fact Satan. So calling someone a viper or snake was basically calling them Satan. So Jesus is now calling them the same thing. You snakes, you agents of Satan, you agents of evil. How will you escape being condemned to hell? How are you going to, you who are so unrighteous, how are you going to escape the punishment for the unrighteous? Now, the word translated there in the NIV and other translations as hell was the word Gehenna. Gehenna was the name of the valley just outside of the city of Jerusalem, where many of the Jewish kings, the kings of Judah, actually sacrificed their children on altars to a foreign god, Moloch. Totally contrary to God's law. And as a result, that valley became defiled. Later, they would take that valley because it was defiled, that is, going over to it could make you unclean, and they made it the area that they would dump their garbage from outside the city. And they dumped the garbage and they would burn it. And in this valley, where this garbage was, there was a constant burning of the garbage with the smell and the maggots and all that goes on with a burning garbage dump. Well, this was the imagery that was used that we now translate hell. That was the punishment, having to spend eternity in that kind of circumstance, the punishment, the agony, etc. So he says, how are you going to escape this punishment? Therefore, I am sending you prophets and sages and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify, others you will flog in your synagogues and pursue town to town. Little prophecy here. He says, you murderous generation, you're just like your parents, and you're going to continue to receive prophets, persons who will attempt to lead you to repent, to turn your back, to clean up your inside. But you're going to kill them. You're going to flog them in your synagogues. In other words, Jesus is saying, you're not going to change. He says, them you will kill and crucify, others you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from your towns. And of course that happened. In the early church, the Jews did continue to persecute those who were teaching Christ resurrected. And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. He says, you're going to continue in your way, and you are going to be punished. And you're going to be punished because you are basically doing what your parents did, rejecting God's messengers. All the blood that's been spilt of the righteous. And now he uses two names that's caused some confusion, but let me give you this explanation. The name from Abel, of course, Abel was the son of Adam and Eve. And Abel was killed by his brother Cain. And, of course, we know that story. Abel, the story of Abel, is in the very first part of Genesis, the very beginning of the Old Testament. Now, the reference to Zechariah, some see this as speaking of the author of the book of Zechariah, which is toward the second to the last book in the Old Testament. However, there's no reference in that book to his being killed. However, in 2 Chronicles, end of 2 Chronicles, chapter 24, verses 20 and 21, there is a reference to a Zechariah being killed. Then the Spirit of God came upon Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, the priest. He stood before the people and said, "This is what God says. Why do you disobey the Lord's commands? You will not prosper. Because of you, the Lord has, because you have forsaken the Lord has forsaken you. But they plotted against him, and by order of the king, they stoned him to death in the courtyard of the Lord's temple. So there is that reference to a prophet by the name of Zechariah, who is ordered by the king to be killed because of his prophecy. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, in the original Hebrew Bible, the books were arranged differently than what they are in the Christian canon. In the Hebrew Bible, 2nd Chronicles was the last book of the Bible. So Zechariah would be from the last book, whereas Abel is from the first book. This is symbolically saying you are going to suffer for the blood of all the prophets that have been killed throughout Jewish history. All of Jewish history. From the beginning of the first book, Genesis, to the end of the last book, 2nd Chronicles. All that's going on there, you are going to receive that punishment. So he says, he's saying to them, this is coming on them. Now he's moved from talking about where they are to the fact that they are so unclean inside that they're going to continue to murder and kill. And he says, and then you will be punished for all that has happened in Jewish history. And then Jesus gives a word of prophecy. It's not clear it's prophecy, but when we look at it from our advantage point, we can see he was speaking prophecy. Truly I tell you, all this will come on this generation. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you are not willing. Look, your house is left desolate. What's he saying? He's impliedly making a prediction here of what was going to happen in just a few short years. Jesus, at the time he is speaking, somewhere around, maybe around 30 AD. We know that between 67 and 73 AD, the Jews will revolt against Rome, and Rome will come in and destroy the city, destroy the temple, and eventually deport the Jews into other parts of the world. They destroy Israel as a nation. Okay? Jesus is making that prediction because he says, this is going to happen to you. In the same way, let's go back to that part. He says, truly I tell you, all this will come on this generation. And sure enough, some 30 years later, this happens. Some 30 to 40 years later, they see the city destroyed, the nation of Judah. And they themselves will be punished because of all that's unrighteousness throughout the Jewish history. He says, how I long to protect Jerusalem. He says, speaking of his love. Now, he's speaking what sounds like anger, but it's not out of an anger that we know of in the human sense. It's a righteous indignation, if you will. He is saying how I would love to save the city. Now, he uses the imagery there from agriculture that a way a hen would protect her chicks from either a predator or a storm is she would raise her wings and gather her chicks under her wings to protect them. He says, I would love to protect you. I stand ready to protect you. I will protect you. But you have to turn and accept. You're just like all your ancestors. You reject the one sent by God. He says, and as a result, you will suffer the punishment. And then he goes in the very last statement, look, your house is left desolate. Now it's interesting. In other places, he refers to the temple as my Father's house. Here, still standing in the temple, talking to these hypocrites, these Pharisees, and to his disciples. He's speaking to them and he says, your house. he has realized this is not, they're not going to change. He says, your house is left desolate. And sure enough, within just a few years, it will be destroyed. Jesus is speaking to the hypocrites, to the Pharisees. But he's also speaking to the disciples. He's pointing out to the hypocrites their hypocrisy. He's pointing out to the Pharisees their hypocrisy. He's pointing out to them the way they are living, trying to make everyone on the outside think that they are so righteous when inside their hearts they have the wrong attitude, the ultimate attitude of rejection of God's messenger, the Messiah. Jesus is saying to his disciples, don't live like them. Don't live like them. The implication is, if you follow me, if you listen to me, if you allow me to transform you on the inside, because remember, his kingdom is a spiritual kingdom, not a political kingdom. And he wants to transform them on the inside spiritually. And he says, and once that transformation takes place, that will result in the outward acts. Remember, the tree produces fruit. The acts of righteousness should be the product of the tree of righteousness on the inside. Oh, man, in his way he's wired, he can do all he wants to do to try to appear. But unless there's been that transformation on the inside, it'll be nothing but hypocritical conduct. It'll be nothing but hypocrisy. Woe to you hypocrites! How can you escape the punishment of hell? Let's pray. Father, thank you for this time together, this opportunity to look in your word. Thank you for speaking to us and reminding us that our outward acts should reflect our inward attitude. Father, we pray that even this week that you would work in us, transform us, and empower us that we might live the righteousness that you give to us on the inside, that we might live that in outward expressions. May people see us and say of us, as they said of those early disciples there in the book of Acts, he's different because he's been with Jesus. For it's in the name of Jesus that we pray. Amen. Thank you.